So, to be clear, according to Jared Kushner and Cassidy Hutchinson, sworn testimony, it was concerns about the president's cabinet finally, after years of talking about it, doing something and invoking the 25th Amendment to officially, publicly, finally declare him unfit for office. That's what was behind the remarks. In case it wasn't clear that the White House realized by the evening of January 6th the scope of the president's negligence in failing to call off the mob he galvanized. But what might be even more material to investigators is this: Trump's edits to the January 7th speech itself. Watch.
Do you recognize what this is?
It looks like a copy of a draft of the remarks for that day.
Okay. And as you can see throughout the document, there are lines crossed out. There are some words added in. Do you recognize the handwriting?
It looks like my father's handwriting.
It looks like here that he crossed out that he was directing the Department of Justice to ensure all lawbreakers are prosecuted to the full extent of the law. We must send a clear message, not with mercy, but with justice. Legal consequences must be swift and firm. Do you know why he wanted that crossed out?
I don't know.
He also has crossed out, I want to be very clear, you do not represent me. You do not represent our movement. Do you remember? Do you know why he crossed that language out of the statement?
I don't know.
Really? I feel like we could help you. That voice saying, I don't know, was Jared Kushner. The takeaway here, of course, Donald Trump would not call for the Justice Department to prosecute or hold accountable those who broke the law, right? The criminals who violently and unlawfully and illegally carried out Donald Trump's coup attempt at the U.S. Capitol, even 24 hours after they committed those crimes. And he refused to distance himself from the insurrectionists. He refused to say, you don't represent me. The opposite of that, of course, is you do, right? The new evidence put out by the January 6th committee comes as investigators make it abundantly clear that they're moving full steam ahead, even after the last public hearing of the summer has concluded. Committee Vice Chair Liz Cheney saying this weekend that the possibility of a subpoena is still very much on the table for one Ginny Thomas. Of course, Ginny is the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. But the January 6th committee isn't the only investigative threat looming over the disgraced, deplatformed, twice impeached ex-president and his close friends. The New York Times today highlights Georgia's probe into the scheme to overturn the lawful, thrice recounted election result there. Times writes this, quote, Georgia has been pursuing a quickening case that could pose the most immediate legal peril for the former president and his associates. The Times describes a framework taking shape for a, quote, broad case that could target multiple defendants with charges of conspiracy to commit election fraud or racketeering-related charges for engaging in a coordinated scheme to undermine the election. Both of these investigative fronts turning up the heat on President Joe Biden's Department of Justice and President Joe Biden's Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who remains at this point very much under the radar when it comes to DOJ's investigations into Trump and its potential next moves. A new analysis from Mike Schmidt's reporting at the New York Times describes it like this, quote, the contrast between the public urgency and aggressiveness of the investigations being carried out by the Georgia prosecutors and the congressional committee on the one hand, and the quiet and apparently plotting and methodical approach being taken by the Justice Department on the other hand is so striking that it has become an issue for Mr. Garland and is only growing more pronounced by the week. The parallel investigations barreling ahead against Donald Trump and his associates and questions about what DOJ is doing is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Mike Schmidt is here, New York Times Washington correspondent. Also joining us, former Senator Claire McCaskill and Andrew Weissman, former FBI general counsel and a former senior member of the Mueller probe. All of them, lucky for us, MSNBC contributors. Mike Schmidt, take us through your fantastic reporting, which puts these three things sort of on the shelf all next to each other in a really striking way.
Look, the question that has emerged from the hearings is, what is the Justice Department going to do? And the reason those questions have come out is because the committee has done such an effective job at telling their story. And that has put this pressure on Garland. But as I pointed out in the piece, the gears of justice at the department always move the slowest. And that pace has forced Garland to have to respond, as he did last week, to these outside questions about what is going on and what are they doing. Look, the Justice Department, someone once described to me, was sort of like a tank. It may take a little bit of time for it to move its gaze, but once it hones in on something, it really goes after it. And that's what we may be seeing here, is that a Justice Department that took its time to get to this place is truly digging in and catching up to where the committee and the prosecutors in Georgia are. And the thing about the committee to understand is that they are unbound by many, if not all, of the rules that the department is bound by about what it can talk about publicly, what it can talk about in terms of its investigations, the broad strokes of it, and the type of evidence that they can use. The committee can use any type of evidence that they want. In a courtroom, obviously, those rules are very different. So as the public questions sort of arise and become bigger about what the department is doing, trying to understand the differences between Congress, the Georgia prosecutors, and the department.
Andrew Weissman, Liz Cheney seems so acutely aware of and one step ahead of all of these, but we can't because. I mean, she took on this issue of cross-examination. She said, do you really think that Bill Barr is going to wilt under cross-examination and not call Trump's claims BS? Do you really think that I'm going to get better answers from Pat Cipollone than the Justice Department? Are you kidding? How have they effectively boxed in all those arguments that are the traditional, I don't want to say excuse structure, but the traditional explanations for not moving as quickly as a local prosecutor or congressional committee?
So, I'm hoping that Mike is right, that, what we're hearing from the department, that it's like a tank and, be patient and we're going to get there. And a lot is happening, under the water and you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. I hope that is right. I am somewhat pessimistic, although I do think that the January 6th committee has sort of lit a fire under the Department of Justice. And that's why I think you're seeing those statements, those heartfelt statements by the Attorney General. But here's a good example from the way you began, Nicole, with the January 6th committee material that came out today. One of the things I was struck by was not what was crossed out, but something that was in there, which is a statement that said, I immediately deployed the National Guard and federal law enforcement to secure the building and expel the intruders. So if I were the Justice Department right now, I would view that as a cover-up that Jared Kushner and Stephen Miller and the former president of the United States engaged in to make it seem like the president had not engaged in a coup and he actually was against what happened on January 6th. And that was actually part of the planned speech. And that's the kind of thing that what you want to see the department doing is interviewing those people and issuing grand jury subpoenas, and if necessary, putting those people in the grand jury and forcing them to testify and account for their actions. And I think if that happened, we would be quite aware of it. I think that there are enough defense lawyers who would be squawking and revealing to the public and reporters that was going on. So I'm waiting to see that kind of aggressive action by the department.
Andrew Weissman, what you just said is really important, I think, to make sure that we all understand and that our viewers understand. The reason we can say with some confidence that we know that Donald Trump himself and his conduct and Jared Kushner's and Rudy Giuliani's may not be under investigation is because they've been investigated multiple occasions by you and the Mueller probe, by 2 impeachment inquiries, and we know what they look like and sound like under investigation. They have the right to retain counsel, and their counsel has a pattern now under 3.5, I think, if you count the sort of Stormy Daniels stuff as a half probe, because Michael Cohen sort of implicated Trump in what many thought would be the most egregious crimes, campaign finance violations, which brought down the careers of many, but not Trump. We know what they look like. We know what they sound like. We know what they act like under investigation. From your expert eye, do you see any signs that anyone other than Jeffrey Clark and John Eastman, who Mike makes clear that the fake electors probe and some of those other schemes are very much under investigation at this point. But other than that, do you see any indication that anyone close to Trump or Trump are under investigation by DOJ?
unfortunately, the answer to that is no. I do think that there's a certain amount that would be secret and we wouldn't know about. But I do think once you start issuing grand jury subpoenas and you start putting relatively senior people in the grand jury, that gets out. And just remember that the recipients of grand jury subpoena do not have to keep that secret. And we're very aware from people like Jeffrey Clark and John Eastman that that's going on, and from others. So I think that we're not seeing any sign that senior people who used to be in the White House under President Trump are being interviewed and being put in the grand jury.
So, Claire, let's keep this forward-looking. Let's keep this productive. The best case scenario is that they weren't, and now they are. Mike's colleagues have also reported that the twice impeached ex-president may be contemplating a second run for the presidency, may announce. Does that make it harder or easier for Merrick Garland to turn up the heat on a probe of Donald Trump?
I'm not sure it ever gets any harder. I think indicting a former president on crimes surrounding a political election is as tough as it gets. But Andrew, as always, is being certain and very articulate about DOJ. Let me put it more plainly. For some reason, in a way that the federal government usually doesn't operate, they've allowed other investigations to get way ahead of them. And that was a choice they made. They allowed a House committee to get first shot at these witnesses, to get them in a deposition before the federal government had them down to a statement. And if they were getting statements from them, we would know about it because they'd all be lawyered up. So what were they thinking? Did they think just by going after the mob, that would be enough until Liz Cheney and that committee basically threw open the curtains and said, DOJ, hello? So I am very pessimistic that DOJ is, because this is not the way they usually operate. They want to be first on the block, not last on the block. I know, because I've been pushed down the line by them many times in investigations where I was not allowed to get evidence and witnesses because they claim dibs. So it is very unusual for them to be last to the party. And I think the decision is always a tough one, but he took the job knowing that this was looming. He knew that when he took the job. And I hope I'm wrong, but I'm worried that a terrible precedent is going to be set by this particular attorney general.
I want to read some new reporting that NBC has to you, Mike, because it sort of bears out Claire's point. Mark Short, who testified, it would appear reluctantly by saying things like, I'm here under subpoena, and going on Fox News and saying, yes, I cooperated with the January 6th committee, but I had to, I was subpoenaed. Mark Short, of course, is the chief of staff to the vice president. His testimony was used in the tape depositions that were shown during that rather dramatic public hearing where Greg Jacobs, who was his counsel, testified to never before publicly aired evidence that the vice president refused to get in the car and basically ran the executive branch of the government from the basement of the United States Capitol, where he waited until it was safe to go upstairs and certify President Biden's victory. So this has been reported since we've been on the air. A source familiar with the matter tells NBC News that Mark Short, who was chief of staff to Vice President Pence, appeared last week under subpoena before a Washington, D.C. federal grand jury investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The development was first reported by ABC News. The source wouldn't discuss details of the testimony, but Short's grand jury appearance is an indication that the Department of Justice's investigation into January 6th has expanded beyond those who attacked the Capitol and those involved in the so-called fake elector schemes. So maybe a brick in the wall against Claire and Andrew's pessimism?
Look, it would certainly be a sign that the Justice Department investigation being led by Thomas Windom is looking at and trying to talk to individuals at that closest rung around the president. That has sort of been the biggest question to this point, is that why is it that people like Mark Short had not been talked to, but they had talked to the committee? So this would certainly be a sign that the department is honing its focus directly in on those individuals and trying to get information from them. It's important to remember what Short was there for. He was there for the efforts by Eastman and Trump to pressure Pence. He was helping to respond to that. He was helping make sure that Greg Jacob was coming up with a legal rationale that Pence could rely on, coordinating with conservative lawyers outside the administration who were trying to help Pence. He was at the center of all of these things and dealing directly with Pence as Pence had to confront Eastman and Trump as they came up with this bogus legal scheme to where they essentially said that Pence could pick the president when he went for the certification. So it's not just that Short is in the Capitol on January 6th and witnesses what is going on with Pence and Pence's reluctance to leave and the violence there. He was directly a direct witness to everything that was going on in terms of the internal pressure campaign on Pence.
Andrew Weissman, I want your thoughts on everything Mike is reporting, but he's also an important witness in the knowledge 24 hours ahead of time that there would be violence, and the violence would be directed at Mike Pence. He calls in the Secret Service, who have now become sort of the flashing yellow light in all of the questions about who knew what and when. He knows 24 hours before January 6th goes down the way it does that Pence is in danger. And he calls in Secret Service and tells them on the 5th, hey, Pence could be in a dicey situation tomorrow. Talk about Short's testimony and knowledge 24 hours ahead of time of violence.
So the violence is incredibly important in terms of proving a case, particularly if you're trying to make a case on seditious conspiracy against the former president, because that requires the Department of Justice to prove that there was obstruction of Congress by force. So his awareness the day before and who he can say was also aware of it, for sure, the Secret Service was aware of it. So the idea that the president of the United States was unaware would seem laughable. So he's an important witness to that. As Mike points out, he's also an important witness to the president lying about saying the vice president was always on board with the fact that he agrees that the president says that the vice president does not have to count the votes, that he has the power to say no, when we know that the vice president's view was no, he doesn't have the power. So he's an incredibly important witness. And I also think if that reporting is correct, the fact that the Justice Department is putting him in the grand jury is really good practice. In a political corruption case, just interviewing people is rarely sufficient. You have to lock people in under oath. There's no better way than to do that in a grand jury. So they can't later sort of wriggle out and say that the FBI, whoever's taking notes, misinterpreted what was said. So the fact that he went into the grand jury would be, I think, very significant.
And it seems that, Claire, if the violence is what is under scrutiny or becomes something that's under scrutiny, or I guess we already know that the violence carried out by the insurrectionists is under investigation. They're charging them. They're trying these cases. They're winning these cases. The date on knowledge of violence, at least from Short's testimony, is the 5th. Cassidy Hutchinson testifies that on the 2nd, Rudy says, make sure Trump goes. It's going to be wild. And on the 2nd, Meadows knows it's going to be, quote, real bad. So you've got Meadows, who knows on the 2nd, and Rudy, who knows on the 2nd it's going to be really violent. You've got Short, who knows on the 5th it's going to be violent. You've got Trump, who knows that the weapons are there once the mag's down, so the armed supporters with AR-15s in the trees can come on in. And then on the 7th, he can't say you're not with us. The opposite of that is you are with us. He can't say you will be prosecuted. The opposite is you won't be prosecuted. How is Trump not the beating heart of the violence?
He is the beating heart of the violence. He's the first one who said it will be wild. And then all of his minions took up the cause. I think the evidence is very clear. And I think what Andrew pointed out earlier is huge. That in that statement he made, he lied. He never called the National Guard. He never called anybody except Rudy and some senators continuing to try to get them to obstruct an act of Congress. So the only calls he made were to his pretend lawyers and to his sycophants in Congress. He never called law enforcement, never called the National Guard. All of this is very compelling. But I would just point out again that the added problem the Department of Justice has now, yes, it's great they're getting this testimony in front of a grand jury under oath. But every single witness that is key to this now has another set of statements. And I can assure you, no matter how good a witness is, every statement they give is slightly different. And that is grist for cross-examination. Well, you said this on this day. You didn't say it this way on this day. And sometimes the littlest of differences that really didn't mean anything get blown out of proportion in front of a jury. So that's why it's so important that typically law enforcement wants to be the first one to get someone down in terms of what happened. Now there's going to be a lot of different statements in front of the committee on depositions, recorded statements, interviews that they're going to have to deal with, assuming they might go forward.
Andrew Weissman, let me ask you about the FBI. We talk about Merrick Garland. We talk about how they will, whatever happens next, it will follow the congressional probe. It will follow Fani Willis. Where's the FBI in all this? Are they capable of initiating and driving the need to investigate crimes?
That is such a great question, particularly if you focus on one aspect that we know is being investigated, which is the sort of Department of Justice scheme, and that involves John Eastman and Jeffrey Clark. And that, for people who are not following the details, that is the scheme to lop off the heads of the Justice Department who are unwilling to go along with the scheme to say that there was fraud in the election, and to issue a letter saying that that's under investigation. By all accounts, that is being investigated by the Inspector General's office, which is a sort of small, unique part of the Justice Department, but not by the FBI. That's very unusual. I had thought that the Inspector General would work with the FBI. When I was in the department, I frequently would have an investigation with the FBI and the Inspector General's office, because you want those added resources and that expertise of the FBI. But it's really worth remembering the FBI reports to the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General. So, if Merrick Garland wants the FBI involved, he has the power to make that happen.